Okay, a very good morning to Reverend Father Dr. Father Sajubute Seri, our Vice Principal of Deanery of Arts and Humanities, the Head of Department of Political Science, Relation College Siliguri, faculty members, our esteemed resource person for the day, and my dear students. I welcome you all in this special lecture being delivered by Dr. Shoradeep Sen, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, University of North Bengal, on the topic, not a bang but a whimper, interrogating the war on Ukraine. So as we all know that it has been more than a year now that various scholars, various thinkers have been observing this war, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the tremendous impact that this war has made on global politics. So today we have this occasion to hear from one such scholar and professor on the same issue. So without delaying any much further, I would now request Reverend Father Dr. Sajubute Seri, our Vice Principal, to lead us into the prayer and few words if he has something to say.
Good morning. Good morning to all. Good morning. So waiting quite some time, was a little delay. Without much ado, let's start off. Let's bow our heads before God. Good morning. Short prayer. Good morning to all. Good morning. Best lecture. Living in these uncertain times, oh God, you are so certain before us, seeing turmoil and turbulence all around us, you are the peace within us. Though the future may seem unclear, you are the light that illumines our path. Almighty God, as we gather here to participate in this special lecture, we ask you to strengthen us, inspire us with your wisdom and knowledge. Gracious God, we thank you for all the gifts that you give us. You have showered on us much blessings, your inspiration and guidance and protection. We pray that you deepen our comprehension, broaden our thinking, and transform our understanding. May we humbly ask you to shower your grace on our resource person today, Dr. Shoradeep Sen. Bless all the organizers, faculty members, and all the students present here today. Make this prayer in your name, God of all life and endless possibilities. Good morning. Can you be awake? Nobody's sleeping? It's cool. Okay, this is a very interesting topic. Ukraine war. There was one person came from Russia when this war was going on, middle of, maybe a few months back. And the person said, we do not know that this war is going on between Russia and Ukraine. So all of Russia did not know that war was going on. But the rest of the world knew what was going on. So all that is, what I want to say is that all that is given out through news or newspapers or all other information that you receive from different sources is not exactly the truth. Whether it is Ukraine war or any other war, any other incident that is taking place. Now Manipur issue is going on, similar to that kind. Now none of you know exactly what is the reason. Ultimately it is fingering point at the corporate. The real reason why things happen, but it's projected as something else. Now what the newspapers, what the TV news and everything, all information that is given to us. So what I want to say is that don't take things as it comes. Don't accept things as it comes. Don't swallow all the information that you receive. Segregate, analyze, critically, check everything that is coming to you as future political leaders possibly, political analysis, political thinkers. You should never take things as it comes. You have to always critically see the situation and go to the truth, the real fact. Because the truth is only one, not many things. But information, many kinds, many opinions it can come. I think sir will enlighten us on this particular aspect today. I hope you'll have a wonderful morning with sir and can of course ask questions. There is enough time for that. Always ask questions. That's the sign that you are thinking. Okay? Don't feel shy. Don't be afraid of asking questions. There's no wrong question at all. Every question is correct. So all that is coming to your mind, always put forward in words and clarify. That's the time that you can imagine that you are thinking, start thinking about the topic. Okay, wish you all the best. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Father. Now I would like to request Mr. Minju Sherpa, our assistant professor in the department, for the introduction of a resource person for the day.
So, very good morning, respected Father Vice Principal, Father Dr. Sajaputichari, and we are ready for this delay. So, without delay, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my teacher and the distinguished resource person for today's lecture, Dr. Sauradip Sen. Dr. Sen is an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Bengal, renowned for his profound insights into international relations. His expertise delves into complex realm of strategic studies, foreign policy, political philosophy, international relations theory. We are honored to have him here at Salesian College to share his knowledge and perspectives on the topic, not a bang but a whimper, interrogating war on Ukraine. Dr. Sen's academic journey is marked by exceptional achievements. He graduated as a gold medalist from Presidency University before earning his doctoral degree in international relations from Jadavpur University. So his prolific contributions extend beyond the confines with academia, encompassing extensive research papers, book chapters, and reviews in prestigious journals such as SAGE, Council for Political Studies, Vivekananda International Foundation, and in many more journals. So his scholarship has also found its place in the edited volumes, which further reflects the depth of his expertise in his field. The scope of Dr. Sen's work is diverse, covering themes ranging from nuclear strategy and terrorism to the intricate dance of international diplomacy. His publications like Ecology and Administration, revisiting the prismatic model of rhetorics, and nuclear terrorism in the Indian subcontinent attest to his nuanced understanding of global political dynamics. Beyond the written word, Dr. Sen is a dynamic speaker who frequently participates in both national and international conferences and seminars. So shedding light on the critical issues such as war, terrorism, and nuclear strategy. So his commitment to sharing his insights and engaging in thoughtful discourses is evident in his participation as a speaker and presenter in various academic forums. Notably, he delivered a special lecture in the Convergence of Political Theory, International Relations at Vivekananda College for Women, and presented papers, topics ranging from Indo-Japanese relations to India-Pakistan nuclear rivalry in the renowned institution. To cut it short, his distinguished expertise, coupled with the passion of scholarly inquiry, makes Dr. Sen a beacon of knowledge in the realm of international relations and political science. As we prepare to delve into the intricacies of not a bang but a whimper, interrogating war on Ukraine, let us extend a warm welcome to Dr. Sen and eagerly anticipate the insights he will share with us today. Let us all join in welcoming Dr. Sauradip Sen to Salesian College for what promises to be an enlightening and thoughtful, provoking discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Saminju. I would like to request Reverend Father Dr. Saju to kindly come on the stage, and also would request our resource person, Dr. Saurabh, to sit on the stage. We would request Father to kindly welcome our resource person and felicitate him with a khada and a bouquet. Thank you so much, Father. Thank you so much, sir. Now, this time I give to Dr. Sauradeep for his most awaited lecture in the department. So the podium is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Father Buddhaseri, Mr. Mang, and faculty members of the Department of Political Science. Am I audible? Yes, okay. And my dear students, thank you for having me here, especially since you can say a good realist like me ever gets a forum beyond the confines of a classroom to share his very unpalatable views on war. But, I am here to interrogate the war on Ukraine, and there are various issues that needs to be pointed out. I'll try my best to make it interesting, but it's a happy coincidence for me to be here, and that is because the hall is called the Marengo Hall, and as Father Puthuseri has just said, it has got something to do with Bishop Marengo. But as far as my academic training is concerned, Marengo has another meaning for me, and that is the famous Battle of Marengo, where Napoleon defeated the Austrian forces in northern Italy. Now, when I was reading into the war, and when I was seeing in about a year back that the war is going really badly for the Russians, and I asked myself, what can be the reason of that? And I was reminded of one simple line, one Napoleonic maxim, which he had written and he had implemented in the Battle of Marengo, and I thought that I would start with that. And perhaps that is what I realized was the reason why the war was going badly for the Russians. And I said to myself, I surmised that perhaps Putin has forgotten his Napoleon. So let me begin. Can I have the first slide? Can you change the slide, please? Yes. So Napoleon said in 1794, attacks must not be disseminated, they must be concentrated. That is, when you're going to war, you have to ensure that you fight your enemy as a concentrated force and not disseminate or disperse your attack. Once you do that, you're sure to lose a war. And that is exactly what the Russians were doing back in 2022, in August of 2022. And that is when I remembered my Napoleon and thought perhaps Putin has forgotten his Napoleon. And but that is not the case, because later on, as you've seen, the war has changed in its course, and now the Russians are actually winning the war. So once I begin with my interrogation, before I begin with my interrogation, I must make it clear that I will interrogate this war from the theoretical standpoint of realism. Because realism is a theory that I subscribe to. I have sort of an ontological bias towards realism. And I consider realism to be extremely important, or perhaps indispensable, for the study of warfare, strategy, tactics, and outcomes. So, before beginning with the interrogation, next slide please, let us focus on three core issues that realism talks about as a theory of IR, right? So realism is a theory of IR which has three focal points, right? First is statism, second is survival, and third is self-help, right? That is, realists are statists in their orientation. They believe that the state is the repository of sovereignty, right? That the state is a rational unitary actor in international politics, right? And the state therefore is the primary unit of analysis. That is, realists are statists. And states, realists believe, are extremely interested in their survival. That is, their survival as a sovereign state and their existence in the international system of states, and for that they have to resort to. Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you. For that, they need to resort to certain means of self-help. That is, primarily, this world is anarchical in nature. That is, there is no world government. There is no authority over and above states. So states themselves have to ensure their survival. Nobody is going to help them out in it. Now, for prioritizing survival or for achieving survival, for practicing self-help, states prioritize power and the balance of power. And realists argue that states have a vested interest and incentive in maximizing their power relative to other states. And power in this regard is considered in military and economic terms, that is, in terms of economic prowess and military strength. And that is important because it ensures survival. And as a factor of the international distribution of power, which is not just and equal, it's quite lopsided. There are some states who are considered as great powers and some lesser powers, right? Or you can say in the system there are few great powers and many lesser powers, right? And great powers, because of their power and position in the hierarchy of states, they do take advantage of lesser powers because they are weaker states. And so realists prescribe weaker states to be very mindful of the balance of power. That is, you need to balance out a stronger adversary, right, by aligning with, say, another stronger state if you have to ensure your survival. Right? So that is the first point which I made, power and balance of power. The second point is that realism prioritizes a dual set of morality for statesmen, one for the domestic politics and one for the international arena, right? Both types of morality or ethics are different. And realists are proponents of raison d'etre, that is, the reasons of state, right? And realists consider that the state is an ethical community in and by itself, right? There is no ethical authority over states, and that is why the world is considered as anarchical. Moreover, realists are agnostics insofar as the domestic political order is concerned. That is, realists don't discriminate among democracies and non-democracies. Right? Because our logic is that every state, irrespective of the domestic political order, seek power for their survival. And every state compete for power, irrespective of the domestic political order. They want to maximize their relative power for ensuring security, for ensuring that their national interests are met, and for survival in an anarchical world. And last point in this regard is that realism or realists are, because we are students of the great captains in history like Napoleon and Frederick the Great, and the great theorists of war such as Karl Clausewitz and Khomeini and what have you. So we do not think that war does not have a utility in international politics. That is, we consider war to be an unsavory action, but nonetheless something that states do resort to. So war, according to realists, are necessary instruments of statecraft in an imperfect world that we live in. And statesmen do wage wars to further national interests as perhaps rational instruments of survival. If the nation state, survival of the nation state is at stake and every other mechanism of dispute settlement has failed, such as diplomacy, etc. Now, what gives realists a bad name is that most people forget that realism is not all about power. It is also about prudence, about good judgment, right? So realists, more than preaching a wild thrust towards power, are more interested in the practice of prudence, right? Good judgment in using power tools or force in the international arena. That is, prudence should be prioritized in the use of military force, because more often than not, when military force is used, there is a possibility of a blowback to cause resentment. Like, for example, you treat Pakistan's attack on India in 1965, 1971, right? All those things actually failed and caused more resentment in Pakistan than in India, right? Or the American war on Iraq in 2003, which ultimately snowballed and created the ISIS in West Asia, right? So now that you have a more or less, reliable understanding of who I am or what I subscribe to, let us begin with our interrogation. Next slide, please. So this interrogation will be based on 3 questions. What is the present state of the war, right? Who is responsible for the war? And what is the likely continuation period, or where is the war likely to culminate? So next slide. So let us begin with part 1 of the lecture, the present state of the war. Here we are going to study competing threat perceptions, strategic objectives, and then we are going to have a bird's eye view of battlefield Ukraine. That is the tactical and strategic aspects of the war. Right? Now, when you consider the threat perceptions, like what is threat perception? Threat perception is simply the way in which states perceive other states as existential threats, as a threat to their survival. I told you, realism prioritizes survival. So, competing threat perceptions. And when you have to, look into threat perception, there is nothing to do but to ground it within the Eurasian geopolitics of today, right? You have to ground it within the manner in which geopolitics or the political implications of geography plays out in today's world as far as Eurasia is concerned, because the Ukraine war is actually an Eurasian war, right? So next slide, please. So here is the map. I hope you can see, all of you, because this is important. Now, when you look at this map, this is a little hazy. I didn't expect it to be hazy, but anyway, so have a look at the color coding. On the one hand, you have the Russians, right? And the Russians are coded in red, and these blue states are the NATO states. There are some states coded in gray, which are actually neutral states. You have Switzerland, Austria, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. And there you have Belarus, but Belarus is not neutral. Belarus is a Russian ally. And then you have Moldova, MD, which is a non-NATO neutral state in Eastern Europe, right? So this is what the European geopolitics looks like. You have Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and Ukraine. This is where the war is taking place right now, right? It is coded in yellow for to distinguish it between these two sides. That is, it wants to join NATO. It is not yet a part of NATO. It is a partner of NATO, but it is also at war with Russia. So this is a different zone altogether. This is battlefield Ukraine. Okay, so you have competing threat perceptions here. If you remember the Cold War, that is the time when NATO was created, 1949, right? And NATO was created as a collective security organization, where an attack on one state would be perceived as an attack on all states. Okay, so you have military forces, conventional military forces, nuclear forces, everything, right, together under one banner, and that is the organization NATO. And so when the Cold War was on, NATO had a reach up till here, you can say, Eastern Germany, okay? And then you have from Poland onwards, the Warsaw Pact. That was a completely different story. So those two blocks were at loggerheads, they were against each other. And when the Berlin Wall fell, that is when the Cold War ended, right? All these Eastern European states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, you have Romania, Bulgaria, all these states, the former Yugoslav states here, right? They were outside of Warsaw Pact, right? So when the Cold War ended, NATO was still in Western Europe. It did not spread to Eastern Europe. So the threat perception was completely different. Okay? Now, because of American policies, because of the policies of these Eastern European states, NATO has now come almost close to the doorsteps of Russia. You have the former Soviet republics here, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, right? They're also NATO states. And recently Finland and Sweden has also joined NATO. So you have competing threat perceptions here. Russia feels that NATO is an existential threat. NATO feels that Russia is an existential threat, right? And then you have Ukraine, which has started to feel after 2014 that Russia is an existential threat, and it would be wiser to actually ally with NATO. And then you have Turkey here as a long-standing NATO ally since the 1950s. So here you have competing threat perceptions throughout this year, right? I won't go to the individual countries because that will take the whole day. So if you look at another thing here, which is again quite essential, if you look at the eastern side of this map, right, east of NATO, east of Ukraine as well, you have Russian territories and some territories here on the eastern border of Turkey, and some countries here, the region which is called the Transcaucasus. Okay, so let us look at the Transcaucasian threat perception now. Right? Next slide, please. So in the Transcaucasus, so this is the map exactly east of the previous map. You have the Black Sea, the eastern side of the Black Sea, and bordering Black Sea, you have Russia, you have Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkey. Turkey is a NATO state. Georgia wanted to join NATO, but was stopped in 2008. And then you have an ongoing war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over this small strip of land called the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The war is still ongoing, right? There's a ceasefire, but there's no settlement. And because of that, you also would have to understand the alliances or the spheres of influence. Russia considers the Transcaucasus as its own backyard, as its own sphere of influence. So they do not want to have NATO in this particular region. And that is one of the reasons why you have an interstate war between the Georgians and the Russians in 2008. And not only that, you have Russian occupation of two strategic territories in Georgia, even now. The South Ossetian region and the Abkhazian region. These are the two places where the Russian military is still present, but this territory is, thank you, sir. This territory is in Georgia, right? And if you look at this particular dynamic over Nagorno-Karabakh, you'll see that Azerbaijan is an ally of the Turkish, okay? Armenia is an ally of the Russians. And don't forget that these two seas are actually very oil-rich seas. So you have to understand it from the geopolitical perspective. All the bordering states want to have a share, a piece of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And who gets what, when, and how, right? That is the fundamentals of geopolitics. So there are competing threat perceptions which you have to ground within the geopolitics of Eurasia. Okay? And you can't discount Iran as well. Iran is a long-standing American detractor. Okay? If Iran is a long-standing American detractor, then the Russians have an incentive in bringing Iran within its folds. Right? That is why Iran is a member of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Russian NATO now. Right? So you have to understand that the threat perceptions of three main actors in this war, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the West and US, taken together, NATO, differ, and they are entangled within the complex web of Eurasian geopolitics. Right? So let us focus now on the competing threat perceptions of, sort of three of the main actors. Right? First, let us begin with the Russians, okay? Because they are the ones who sort of invaded Ukraine, not without provocation, but they were the invaders. So let us begin with their threat perception, because it's the easiest way out. So Russians have a threat perception, that is, they consider NATO and the expansion of NATO as existential threats, right? Expansion of NATO where? Into its own sphere of influence. Can I have the previous map, please? Previous one. Yes. So into its sphere of influence. When the Soviet Union was there, the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union was up to Eastern Germany, right? It has been reduced because of the fact that the Soviets actually lost the Cold War, right? And the NATO states won, right? Or the Americans won. So even if that is so, the Soviets' successor state, the Russians, do not want NATO near its doorsteps because of the history of Cold War rivalry. So they have this perception of an existential threat to their survival, right? If NATO is close to Russian borders. And that is why they need at least a few buffer states between themselves and NATO. Like Belarus, like Ukraine. Okay? Belarus will never join NATO. Belarus is a dictatorship, pro-Russian dictatorship. Okay? NATO only has democratic states, so far. So, and that is the reason why Ukraine is a bone of contention. And also Georgia. Okay? So let us move quickly. Putin has been saying from 2008 at least that NATO cannot extend its borders all the way to Georgia and Ukraine, right? That is, you can't have control over the Black Sea on all the three sides, right? Leaving us only a small piece of land in the middle, right? Because we have to depend on its energy resources. We have to tap energy resources from the Black Sea. So I would like to read a small, a small paragraph to you. This is what, and the West sort of understood that Putin is not going to tolerate NATO in his borders, right? But they nonetheless went ahead with it. And there's a leaked diplomatic cable coming out of WikiLeaks, which was sent in 2008 after the decision was taken in the Bucharest summit to include Georgia and Ukraine within the folds of NATO. Right? William J. Burns, he is a former Russian ambassador, right? US ambassador to Russia. He said, "Niet means niet." That is no means no, right? Niet is no in Russian. And he says, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. That is, these are the reddest of all red lines that Russia feels exist geopolitically. What did he say? He said that not only does Russia perceive encirclement, this particular movement of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO as encirclement, and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, that is a sphere of influence, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which could seriously affect Russian security interests. So the West knew it. And nonetheless, they went ahead with plans to expand the eastern borders of NATO. Now, the second existential threat is, or the Russian existential threat in this case, is to turn Ukraine into a pro-Western democratic bulwark against the Russians. Right? That is, again, a strict no-no for the Russians. That is, if you have a democracy in Ukraine, then Ukraine may, and it has decided to join NATO, right? So it is again an existential threat. The third existential threat is with regard to NATO in the South Caucasus. if NATO increases its sphere of influence within the South Caucasus, then major Russian allies like Armenia, like Iran, may fall prey to NATO's military coercion. Yeah. So what about the Ukrainians? This is about Russia's, existential threats or threat perceptions. The Ukrainians did not perceive the Russians as an existential threat before 2008. Right? Now, what would you say can be the reason for these Eastern European states to join NATO then? Right? It is simply because NATO provides a very solid security cover. Right? NATO states are more or less secure, and they believe that NATO, if they are part of NATO, then their survival is ensured. Okay. And why did the Americans allow Eastern European states, previous slide, Eastern European states like Poland, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, right, all these Eastern European states to join NATO? It was not because of the fact that the Americans were very interested in increasing the security of these small, weaker states. It was because the Americans wanted to make NATO stronger, right? It was because the Americans wanted to ensure that NATO succeeds in the long run, that NATO is a strong alliance which sort of holds the balance of power in Europe in its own hands. Right? So, after 2008, after the war in Georgia, after Russia launched its attacks on Georgia, and this threat perception of the Russians by the Ukrainians increased after 2014, when Russia occupied the Crimean Peninsula. Right? And it is absolutely, very easy to understand why the Russians now consider, why the Ukrainians now consider Russians as existential threats, especially after 2022, because they have waged a war on Ukraine. Okay? Now, what about Western threat perceptions? Right? Why is the West, or why is the US so interested in Europe? Okay? Apart from, of course, the reason being the promotion of liberal democracy. Okay. So, before 2014, the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe was not predicated on Russia. That is, it was not directed towards containing Russia, because Russia was not a great power yet, right? It was, a weaker state because of the fact that it is a breakaway from the Soviet Union, right? It is a successor state of the Soviet Union. There were many various military and economic problems facing the Russian state. So expansion of NATO was therefore to bring more countries within the alliance and not the other way around. On top of that, the Americans have absolutely no reason to fear the Russians as far as their home turf, their backyard is concerned. Because there is something called the Monroe Doctrine, right? Have you heard of the Monroe Doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine was written in 1823, 200 years back, right? It said that the Americans are not going to tolerate any imperialist power within the Western Hemisphere. That is, if you take into consideration the continents of Northern and Southern America, America is the only big brother there, right? They will not tolerate any other European state. So they have the Monroe Doctrine at home. And that has been effective. That has been applicable since 1823. And that is also one of the reasons why the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in 1962, right? And, the Russians have never had any other designs to have any type of military establishment in the Western Hemisphere, threatening the Monroe Doctrine. But the Americans have, ironically, always threatened the other states' sphere of influence. That is, when it comes to international politics, they have the Monroe Doctrine at home. But they have always worked in blatant disregard of the doctrine of spheres of influence when it comes to any other great power. Right? If they don't happen to toe their line, right? If they are not Britain and France, say for instance. So, the other fact with regard to this threat perception thing is that all this radically changes after 2014. Because 2014, there was a pro-democracy movement in Ukraine, right? And that led to Russia's seizure of Crimea, and the West had to blame the Russians for being aggressive, revanchist, whatever. So, and since 2014 and since the invasion in 2022, you have radical changes in Western threat perceptions, because now the war is dubbed as a war of democracies against authoritarians. Right? Even a world leader like King Charles says that our very values are at stake. The future of NATO is at stake. So, because NATO is so neck deep in its support of the Ukrainians, right? If Russia wins in Ukraine, NATO will probably be destroyed. And the Americans know that. And that is why, even if it is costing them billions of dollars, they're still continuing with their support of the Ukrainians, right? Because it is considered to be a war of values, not just a war of armies, right? A dictatorship against a democratic bloc, right? Or a country that wants to come up as a democracy. But it is going to be a very costly affair. It is still a very costly affair for the Americans, right? And so the last threat perception is that if Ukraine falls and NATO is discredited, then Russia gains geopolitical significance. Russia's sphere of influence may increase. That is, the CSTO, Russia's NATO, may have, a predominant position in Eastern European affairs, or Iran may even think of actually joining the CSTO, and therefore gaining more predominance in West Asia, in Southern Caucasus, whatever. So based on these competing threat perceptions, you may have a study of the strategic objectives, the competing strategic objectives of these states. Right? Next slide. Next. Yeah. So have a look at this. Now, as far as strategic objectives are concerned, it can again be divided into three parts. The US and NATO wants to bring Ukraine into NATO and the European Union at any cost. And this is important now, right? The previous understanding, the pre-war understanding, was that Ukraine would enter NATO without any cost, just like any other Eastern European state. But now, because the Russians have been successful in taking more and more territory in Ukraine, right? The argument now is that, the Western argument now is that Ukraine might have to trade territory to become a member of NATO. Right? And that is absolutely unacceptable as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. That is, if they really had to lose territory, why would they want to join the NATO in the first place, right? Because their sovereignty would be diminished if they actually trade territory and join NATO as a rump state, okay? So, and then, of course, defeat the Russian military in Ukraine. That is the reason why they've been sending aid to the tune of $80 billion. Destroy the Russian economy through sanctions. That has not worked very well for the Americans, because Putin could very effectively sanction-proof the Russian economy. And that is the entire, argument of building a fortress economy in Russia, okay? Then you have, because of the fact that the Americans now know that point number 2 and 3 are actually not working, the rhetoric now is to say that we are going to pursue regime change in Russia, right? That is, Putin should go, right? Enough is enough. And not only that, Putin is going to face a criminal trial in the International Criminal Court as, a war criminal and whatnot. So these are the strategic objectives of NATO. The strategic objectives of Ukraine are more or less the same: join NATO and EU with no cost, that is, without losing territory. Defeat the Russian military in home turf and win back lost territory. Support and tighten Western sanctions on Russia, right? Because, of course, you are pro-West, right? And then support regime change in Russia and Putin's subjection to the ICC trial. And then you have the Russian strategic objectives. Before the war in Ukraine, the fundamental objective was, for Putin, was to implement the Minsk II protocol. That is, the protocol signed in 2015 among Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, which said that the war in the Dombast would be brought to a close, a quick closure, right? There is no more people are going to die in the civil war in eastern and southern Ukraine. But that did not happen. And not only that, there was also the objective of enlarging the CSTO by bringing more and more Eastern European, Transcaucasian, or even West Asian states or Central Asian states into its folds. Right? Then you have another very important strategic objective here, and that is to avoid the Dombast dilemma. That is, the Russians, and that is what probably Father Buguseri was saying, don't trust what the media is saying. The media has been saying that Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine. That is not true. Right? Putin cannot conquer all of Ukraine with, say, roughly 800,000 soldiers. Okay. And he doesn't want to do it because if you do that, you're going to have another Donbass. That is, you're going to have a civil war between ethnic Ukrainians who absolutely hate Russians and ethnic Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine. You don't want a rerun of Donbass. So it is a strategic objective for the Russians to avoid the Donbass problem. But to capture sufficient Ukrainian territory so that Ukraine turns into a dysfunctional state. And and as John Mearsheimer has said recently, into a dysfunctional rump state. And what is the necessity of turning Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state? It is because it would then be disabled to join NATO and EU. And finally, to prevent Russia from functioning as a democracy. That is again a red line for the Russians since 2008. Okay. So now let us have a brief understanding of battlefield Ukraine. Next slide. Okay. Can you go to 2 slides after this one and the next? Next. Yes. Okay. So we are going to follow the footsteps of John Mearsheimer here. Mearsheimer, as you know, is a distinguished service professor in the University of Chicago, one of the few remaining Western original thinkers of our time. And Mearsheimer has given us a very comprehensive understanding of battlefield Ukraine very recently. And as I completely agree with it, I'm going to, follow into his footsteps and talk of basically 3 things. First is the question of territory and population, right? How this is a classic war of attrition and a total war, okay? So, insofar as territory is concerned, Russia has formally annexed at least 4 oblasts or provinces, okay? Can you go back? Yeah. So these are the Russian oblasts, okay? Or states, if you may. And among these states, Russia has annexed Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And of course, including Crimea, which is not an oblast, but an autonomous region within Ukraine. And Dmitry Trenin, Russian strategist, and John Mearsheimer both say that Russia, its military capability factored in, may just conquer another 4 oblasts in Ukraine, right? Which would effectively turn it into a dysfunctional rump state, right? Because then the Russians will control around 46% of Ukrainian territory. Which are those oblasts? They are the ones which are east of the Dnieper River, okay? Dnipro, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. This would turn Ukraine into a rump state because there will be very less territory then to the west of Ukraine. And this would also cut off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, thereby strangling its economy. But the Russians should also take care of the fact that they cannot move closer to Romania. That is, they can take Odessa and sit there, but not go to the Romanian border because Romania is again a NATO state. It would be counterproductive. It would be going near NATO, when the objective is to ensure that NATO doesn't come near you, right? So then you have the second map, please. Yes, and here you can see I've taken this from the BBC and the Institute for the Study of War, from a recent article. You'll see how military control of Ukraine has changed over a period of time. So this is February 2022 when the war had began, and this is when the Russians were rapidly advancing, and finally you have this particular map which shows you how the war has changed and how Russia is now concentrating mainly on the eastern and southern side of Ukraine to take and consolidate its hold on such territory. Now, this has therefore not been a very one-sided war, right? You have red territories turning into purple territories, that is territory regained by Ukraine, right? And then you have, of course, this particular map of the present state of the war. So, considering the exchange of territory, the way in which the war has been unfolding over Ukrainian territory, the tactics used by the contending sides, and the munitions used, right? This sort of comes across as a classic war of attrition. So in land warfare, you must remember, there are two types of war. One is a war of attrition, and the other is a war of maneuver. A maneuver warfare is a dynamic form of warfare, right? If you have read a little bit of on the Second World War, you'll know that the Germans attacked the French, and there is something called the Blitzkrieg, right? Blitzkrieg was an example of maneuver warfare, right? Where the war moves from one place to the other in a dynamic way, where there is a rapid conquest of more and more enemy territory, right? On the other hand, you have a war of attrition, which reminds you of the great battles of the First World War, like the Battle of Somme, like the Battle of Verdun, right? Where the idea is to destroy the will of the opponent to fight. And the tactic is to dig deep into the ground. You dig foxholes and trenches, and you defend your territory from those foxholes and trenches from the onslaught of the army, right, of the opponent. So, a war of attrition is defined by the International Encyclopedia of the First World War as the sustained process of wearing down an opponent so as to force them into physical collapse through continuous losses of personnel, equipment, and supplies, or wearing them down to such an extent that their will to fight collapses. And that is exactly what is happening in Ukraine today, right? It's a war of attrition, it's a war of will, right? It is not moving in a rapid manner, and that is why you have, a very little territory exchange till now, 4 oblasts. Now, because of the fact, can we go to the next? Yes. So now looking at the population, because of the fact that the population balance now stands as at 5:1, right? That is, for every 1 Ukrainian, you have 5 Russians. Okay. So the population balance is actually tilted against the Ukrainians, right? And on top of that, you have 8 million people leaving Ukraine since the beginning of the war. And the entire Ukrainian society and military has therefore been mobilized to fight this invasion. And in this way, it is a total war as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, because their entire society and population are mobilized. But that is certainly not the case for the Russians. Right? They have not mobilized their entire military, they have not mobilized their entire society. Life is going as usual in Russia, in most of the Russian big cities. So Sheimer says that more than the exchange of territory, right, the number of troops, their resolve, the population size of the contenders, and most importantly, the balance of artillery, right, are extremely important as far as winning a war of attrition is concerned. Artillery is actually the god of attrition war. If you don't have artillery, you are likely to lose a war of attrition. So there were 190,000 Russian troops in the beginning, they were doing very badly because of their rusty tactics, because of the fact that they have not fought a sort of a big war after Georgia. So they were being cut down in the beginning. Then there was the mobilization of about 300,000 troops in the fall of last year, and the induction of General Surovikin, who is known as the General of Armageddon, right? He sort of made sure that tactically and strategically the Russian army was fighting better, right? So there was more jointness among the three wings of the military, and that is how the balance of the war, that is the center of gravity of the war, changed. And you have major battles on Kherson and Bakhmut, right? That is in Donetsk and Kherson, where the Russian army could use sort of a tactic called the meat grinder, right? Now what is the meat grinder? The meat grinder simply is a way of using regular and mercenary troops. There are various mercenary outfits working in Ukraine now. Now you must have heard of the Wagner group, right? Have you heard of any other mercenary group working in Ukraine? Because the Western media doesn't want you to. There are Western PMCs, private military companies, in Ukraine as well, right? Like as a counterpoint to Wagner, I mean, I don't know how many of you know this, Wagner was a Western classical composer, right? And he was sort of, you can say, proto-Nazi, right? He was very far right. He was one of the ideological precursors of National Socialism in Germany. And these particular people called themselves the Wagner Group because most of the soldiers in this particular outfit are also neo-Nazis, right? And as a counterpoint to Wagner, you have the Mozart Group. Just think about it, this is funny, right? And the Mozart Group is, a pro-NATO mercenary group fighting in favor of the Ukrainians. You have something called the Asgard, you have something called the Triple Canopy, Northrop, etc. All these PMCs are Western PMCs fighting in Ukraine. But the only problem is that the Russians fund the Wagner Group, and that is why they are successful. Now, the Western PMCs are not getting sufficient funding or equipment. And that is the reason why they are bogged down. They are not even coming out of their trenches or their foxholes or their barracks to fight the Russians. So this is the meat grinder tactic which, Russians have been using. So now, again, going by Sheimer, and this is the last point of this particular part, is that so when you have to break the deadlock in a war of attrition, right, in this particular type of war, you need three things, or you need to understand three things. What is the balance of resolve, right? What is the balance of population? And what is the balance of artillery? And only then you will have an understanding of something that Sheimer calls the casualty exchange ratio, right? How many people are dying per site? Okay, it depends on resolve, and resolve is the same, more or less, because the Ukrainians are resolutely fighting to defeat the Russians are resolutely fighting to take Ukrainian territory. So there is no difference. Then you have the balance of population. As far as population is concerned, you have a 5:1 difference. So for every one Ukrainian, you have 5 Russian, right? Consider yourselves in a brawl, you can understand what type of a disadvantage you would be in if you are Ukraine, right? Then you have the balance of artillery, which is, again, I told you, artillery is the god of war. And this is not Napoleon speaking through me, because Napoleon was an artillery officer. I am saying this because it has been tested over centuries. If you have a blockade type of situation in a war, only an offensive weapon like shelling, breaking that offensive, that defensive installation will actually help you win the war. So insofar as the balance of artillery is concerned, Russians have an advantage of 10 to 1. That is, for every one Ukrainian artillery piece, you have 10 Russian artillery pieces. Huge difference, right? The balance is tilted towards the Russians. So then, don't believe in any propaganda of the West that comes to you through popular media saying that for every 7 Russians, 1 Ukrainian is dying. That is absolutely nonsense, right? Mayor Sheimer says that it is more plausible to say that it's 3:1 or 2:1. That is, for every 2 Ukrainians, 1 Russian is dying, right? And then I'll not go into the question of offense-defense distinguishability because you guys are actually too young for all this. But you will learn by and by if you ever study strategic studies. But the issue here is what the West is doing now. The West is simply passing the buck as far as this invasion is concerned. It was the West that egged the Ukrainians to fight the Russians without ever considering the fact that there can be some type of dispute settlement, negotiation, right? Because that was not on the table ever. So what I'm trying to say is, now the West is trying to pass the buck and call this war a stalemate when actually Ukrainians are dying by the thousands every day. I'll just give you the example of John Kirchhofer. John Kirchhofer is the chief of staff of the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States. He said that the war is at a stalemate. I respectfully disagree with him. The war is not at a stalemate. The Russians are winning this war. You know why? Because of what Mayor Sheimer had said, balance of artillery. And you know why a high-ranking US official like Kirchhofer is actually trying to pass the buck? It is because the Americans are not selling artillery pieces to the Ukrainians. They're selling all other types of weapons. HIMARS missiles, Storm Shadow missiles, cluster bombs, right? Now even there is a talk of the sale of F-16 fighter aircrafts, anti-aircraft technology, and so on. What is the problem with this? Kirchhofer himself says that these weapons are actually not the holy grail of attrition warfare, right? And if you have to consider the question of F-16s, you would have to know that a few F-16s against thousands of Russian fighter planes does not alter the military balance at all. Not only that, the Russians have S-400 surface-to-air missiles with which it can just shoot down an F-16 in flight. They have a range of about 3,000 kilometers, right? This is no joke, right? That is the reason why the West is now trying to pass the buck, right? That we have done what we could, but still they are wasting military aid like so many candy wrappers. So we can't do anything else, right? We can't sell them artillery pieces because artillery is offensive weapons. Who knows if Ukraine tomorrow has a pro-Russian government and they use the same artillery pieces on NATO. So the US is in more of a pickle out here. So what I'm trying to say is, battlefield Ukraine, right, is a mess that the Americans have created. Simple. And I'll tell you why, right? I can see that you're bored, but can I have a little more time? I mean, I don't know. I hope I'm not speaking utter rubbish. Right, so anyway, so I just, if you are interested, then please give me a little more time. There are a lot of things, actually. It would take me 4 hours to complete this, but I think I'll not be given that time. Anyway, so this is a mess that the Americans have created, and the Americans will find very difficult to disengage from. Right? And the Russians will continue their meat grinder involving regular troops and Wagner troops in their limited conquest of southern and eastern Ukraine. Right? So now let us go to something else. The next slide. Yes. So now section 2, and this is not going to be as long as this deals with the causes of war, or the casus belli. Now, we'll study Russian strategies, narratives, and geopolitics as the historical casus belli, right? And then you have Western US encroachments and provocations, pre and post Russia's invasion of Crimea, right? So, next slide, please. So let us first talk of the historical casus belli. Now, Russia, as I have said, has always had a self-defined sphere of influence. Do you want to refer to the map, to the European map, or is it okay? Right? You have a self-defined sphere of influence for Russia as the successor state of the Soviet Union, involving republics, former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe, in South Caucasus, and in Central Asia. Like you've heard of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, right? Uzbekistan, right? All these, Tajikistan, these were all parts of the Soviet Union back in the day. So, historically, the Russians have resorted to 3 distinct strategies for the preservation of their sphere of influence. One is, basically from Western encroachments. One is collective security agreements like CSTO, trying to bring more and more states into the CSTO, especially Central Asian and West Asian states like Iran. Then you have the second strategy involving economic and energy diplomacy, mostly through the sale of minerals, oil, natural gas, military equipment, right, to make more and more states dependent on Russian military hardware, like India. That is one of the reasons why India has been saying that we are practicing strategic autonomy, when what we are actually doing is that we are remaining silent, because if we go against the Russians, it would mean that Putin will stop the sale of missiles, S-400, and aircrafts, right? So this is another Russian strategy of, controlling their sphere of influence. And then you have the third strategy, that is military intervention and outright war, like it happened in Chechnya and Dagestan, first and the second Chechen wars, when Chechnya, a country in the northern Caucasus, wanted to break away and form a different republic from the Russian state. That was again a strict no-no from Ukraine. Right? Then you have attacks on individual states, like Georgia, like Ukraine, like the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, right? Like the Dombast war, for instance, from 2014 to 2017, and so on. Now, this is the first point of the historical casus belli. The second point is with regard to Ukraine in Russian narratives. And this is, I believe, interesting. Because in 2004, Putin is rumored to have told President George W. Bush that Ukraine is not even a real nation. We don't have any, sort of hard proof of this apart from Bush's word of mouth. And you know how that is, right? So we don't have any hard proof. But there is something, so this has been treated as a fact that Putin always wanted to invade Ukraine and take Ukraine back into Greater Russia, like it used to be in the Soviet times. Okay. But that is not true. There is no evidence of this. But Putin did author an article in 2021. If you look into the internet, you will get it. It's called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he argued that Russians and Ukrainians are one people who effectively occupy the same historical and spiritual space. And he was not entirely off the mark here. Because as you know, the history of modern Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian people actually begins in Kiev. Right? So the Vikings attacked, right, in 800s, and then a Viking prince called Vladimir, again, Putin's namesake, right, he took the capital from Novgorod, or the northern city, to Kiev, right, and in Kiev, this Rus, right, the people of Rus, also got into Orthodox Christianity that they imported from Byzantium, right, from Constantinople. And so, you know, the history of the Russian people actually begins in Kiev and not the other way around. Moscow comes much later, in 1147. That's a completely different time, right? So let me read you another small paragraph, this time from a book by Mark Galeotti. It's called The Short History of Russia. And here, Galeotti makes an interesting point, right? So he says, meanwhile, even as their troops battle over the Dombast region, that is, during the Dombast Civil War, the historians of Moscow and Kiev battle over who can claim Vladimir the Great as their own, as Grand Prince of Kiev. Does that mean that the spiritual ancestor of modern Russia is actually Ukrainian? You get my point, right? Or does this mean that the Rurikid pedigree, that is his Viking pedigree, Vikings are, you know, warring tribes of Scandinavia, this Rurikid pedigree provide or prove that Ukraine is truly just a semi-detached part of Russia? Ancient myths, histories, and modern wars can be closer than we might like to believe, and nowhere more so than in the land of the Rus. Right? So there are contending narratives, right, of inclusion and exclusion of the self and the other, of whether Russia starts in Ukraine or Ukraine starts in Russia. And finally, with regard to the historical casus belli, you have the centuries-old Russia's insecurity complex. Its massive size, spanning 7 time zones, right? Its geographical location within the crossroads of Europe and Asia, all mean two things. That Russia is actually open to attack from all sides, geopolitically speaking or geostrategically speaking. Or it may mean that Russia is always everybody's perennial other. That is, the Europeans think that it is Asian, or the Asians think that they are European. And as far as the insecurity complex is concerned, it is actually justified. You know why? Because, have a look at this. Russia as a piece of land has been attacked by the Vikings, the Mongols, the Teutonic Knights during the Crusades, right? The Poles, Napoleon's French in the 19th century, and Hitler's Germans in the 20th century. So, what I'm trying to say is, what Putin is doing, much like the Russian czars and the Soviet leaders, is that he's following a tradition of presenting the world as a hostile place, full of predators, that might pounce on Russia if it shows a moment of weakness or backwardness. Right? And in this regard, in 1941, Joseph Stalin had said an interesting thing, by which he tried to justify his forced collectivization program. Right? Stalin said, she was beaten by the Mongol Khans, she was beaten by the Turkish Beys, she was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords, she was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry, she was beaten by the British and French capitalists, she was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her because of her backwardness, military backwardness, cultural backwardness, political backwardness, industrial backwardness, agricultural backwardness. So Putin's hyper-nationalism is based on this, to turn Mother Russia great again. Right? And that is why he's so ideologically bent in this. To create a fortress economy, to rejuvenate the Russian army. That is Putin's life goal, sort of, right? And And he has been very successful because Russia has indeed emerged as a great power again. Going by the logic of realism, an insecure great power, which has been proved and prodded repeatedly by its geopolitical competitors, often act in unpredictable, unprecedented, and hostile ways. And these are the historical causes of the war. It is not just Ukraine. It is the way in which Ukraine is perceived by the Russians. Right? Next slide. I'll just end. We are almost at the end. Okay? What are the proximate causes of the war? Right? What are the immediate causes of the war? First is the logic and implications of NATO's expansion. Right? NATO said that we need to expand eastwards because we have to make our alliance stronger. Does not necessarily mean that we have to make individual states stronger, like Poland. Okay? And the implication was that back in 2008 again, in the fateful Bucharest summit, where the decision was taken that Georgia and Ukraine would be invited to join NATO, Angela Merkel said that if we do this, Angela Merkel, as you know, was the Chancellor of Germany, right? She said, if we do this, the Russians are going to perceive it as an act of war. And that is exactly what happened. Right? So, now, what does this mean? Right? What is the implication of this? Or what is the history of provocations? Is it just because of the expansion of NATO? It is not entirely that. Because many very reliable Western intellectuals have said, don't expand the NATO. The US has not listened to them. Like George Kennan, like Paul Nitz, like Robert McNamara, right? Like John Mayer Sheimer himself, like Stephen F. Cohen, Richard Pipes, what have you? Foreign policy makers, strategists, scholars of IR have all said that this is suicide. Don't do it. Don't poke the Russian bear, right? But the US was adamant, right? Apart from that, significant things happen, right? And this again is part of international relations totally. So you have the three tranches of NATO expansion: 1999, 2004, 2008, right? Then, after the first tranche of NATO expansion, that is bringing Poland into NATO, you have the US unilaterally withdrawing from the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty. Right? The Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty was signed in the 1970s between the Soviet Union and the US. It was an arms control treaty. It said that defensive weapons like anti-ballistic missiles are banned. Why are they banned? Because they reduce threat credibility. Now in deterrence, if you have a weapon and if I have a weapon, offensive weapon, and if you have a shield and I have a shield, that essentially nullifies deterrence. Right? You will not be afraid of my lathi and I will not be afraid of your lathi. The same thing. So you can't have shields. ABM is a shield. So the US unilaterally withdrew from ABM because the US had every plans of developing a nuclear shield. Right? And then you have Euromain, or the democracy promotion in Ukraine. And again, leaked documents, leaked phone calls reveal that it was actually the Americans who caused the Euromain. Right? Like the phone call between Victoria Nuland, right, the Assistant Secretary of State, and George Pat, then ambassador to Ukraine, right? Nuland said that EU can go to hell, right? We are ensuring that democracy prospers in Ukraine. And what happened? The pro-Russian Yanukovych government was removed by the pro-US, pro-Western government of Petro Poroshenko, right? So Russia said that now this has happened. Now as this has happened, it jeopardizes my deal with the Ukrainian government to use the Black Sea to tap oil resources from the Black Sea, which I have negotiated in the past. So Putin said that the most logical thing to do now is to occupy Crimea, which led to the Dombast war. Right? And then you have the post-Crimean occupation, post-2014 proximate causes by US provocations. First is repeated military exercises of the NATO with its own allies and with partner states. Very, very close to the Russian border. Right? Simulated rocket attacks, like it happened, with Estonia. Right? Simulated rocket attacks, which were dubbed as not a threat to Russia. It is just to show NATO preparedness. Now, NATO preparedness against whom? Against the Russians. So Russia said that, come on, this is not done. Right? This is, again, an existential threat for us. Same thing happened with Ukraine. Before Ukraine war, the US was going into military exercises with Ukraine. And after the Ukraine war, now they are sending aid. So, not only that, they have also decided, or they have also trained Ukrainian army to fight off the Russian threat. This is again considered as a geopolitical provocation. ABM sites in Romania and Poland. So as I have told you, unilateral withdrawal from ABM Treaty 2001 to the creation of ABM sites in Romania and Poland. What is the meaning of that? And not only that, these ABM installations can use offensive weapons because they use the Mark 41 Aegis missile launchers, which can be modified to carry nuclear payload. So ABM are no longer defensive weapons, they can be configured into offensive weapons. Again, a threat, a provocation for the Russians. Lastly, unilateral withdrawal from the INF Treaty. That is, the Trump administration said that the Russians are cheating. Okay, they are developing intermediate range nuclear missiles, which was not exactly true. The cheating was more actually in a technical domain than in proliferating actually new missiles. But Putin had said, when Trump had, sort of unilaterally moved the US away from this INF treaty, he said that let us have another treaty. Let us have a new arms control treaty, to which the Americans just did not agree to. Now, Trump is as complicit as Biden. Because what did Biden do? Biden, when he was vice president under Obama, was handling the Ukraine portfolio. Right? And he was extremely hawkish about Ukraine. That is, he wanted Ukraine to be a pro-West partner, member of NATO and EU. And when Zelensky won, you must remember that Zelensky won on a peace platform. That is, his argument was that we are going to negotiate with the Russians so that the war in the Dombast ends. Right? Biden said, why would you want to do that? We are going to provide you with weapons. We are going to provide you with aid. Come and join us. Become a pro-Western democracy. That is what Zelensky did, and the result is all in front of us. And you can't also forget that there was something called the Geneva Summit in 2021, where nuclear strategists like me actually thought that the political context would be better because Putin and Biden would now meet face to face, and probably they are going to exchange some reassurances. Right? What do we find? We find a very old Biden wearing aviators, saying that I have mightily threatened Putin. Right? I have said, don't cross the line. I have said this, I have said that. Right? I have just asked him to behave himself. That is not what you do to a great power. So the political context became worse, and the war was just in the offing. So the policies of Biden are actually as important in this regard as probably Trump's. So we'll end here because I can see that you're getting jittery. I'll just, yeah, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so we'll discuss this in the Q&A if you have, right? These are certain plausible scenarios with regard to the war. If you have any questions, do ask, right? And if you have any questions on these, then definitely, since this portion will remain uncovered, right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was you very meticulously put forward the brief outline and analysis of the ongoing war. So if students have questions, please feel free to clarify your doubts.
Yes, okay.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, your
So
name,
my
please.
question is
Name first.
Sir Keshav Sharma.
Okay.
Sir, I am from Political Science Department, 5th semester.
This is not on. This is not on. Okay, just a minute, Keshav. Right? I'll come to you. No. Now working? Okay, I'll take your mic if I have to, right? You can ask your question. Just ask your question.
So, sir, basically, whatever I understood so far from the seminar, we talked about NATO. So NATO, sir, was made as a defensive organization against, to counter Cold War, basically.
Counter the Soviet Union.
Soviet
Yes,
Union,
yes.
basically. So, but after,
Not defensive necessarily. Yes.
so, but it was not aggressive in its nature early. It was like they are neither in support nor they are favoring. It was something like that. NATO, if I'm not wrong, sir.
You mean with regard to, yes, you mean with regard to the post-Cold War scenario, right? Yeah, okay, you're in the right, yes.
Sir, but as per overall understanding and whatever I have gone through, maybe I have gone through wrong information, but sir, it as per I feel it's the NATO who poked Russia to be aggressive and attack on Ukraine. So is it so? I mean,
It is so.
so because as per 1998, if I'm not wrong about the date, NATO took a aggressive stand. NATO took an aggressive stand against, so I'm forgetting the country name, and they invaded without taking permission from the UNO, the Security Council.
Are you talking about Kosovo?
Yes, sir, if I'm not wrong, so I'm forgetting the name. So, sir, it was kind of a tempting to Russia to come into a war, maybe basically to have a mindset, go against NATO. Was it something like that?
No, not entirely, but the threat perception with regard to the Russians have evolved and changed. Okay, I'll just give you a simple way of remembering this for future reference, right? One is that when at the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union was dismantled, okay? Russia became the successor state of the Soviet Union. And Russia was extremely weak economically, right? So it would need more time, more resources to grow, isn't it? So at that point of time, it was the unipolar moment. You've heard of this term, unipolar moment in IR, right? Which means that, the world had only one power pole, and that was the United States. So the Cold War was over. There was only one global hegemon. There was absolutely no threat coming from the Russians because Russia was dependent on the West for its economic revival. Okay? And even during Kosovo, that was the case. And even the entire presidency of Boris Yeltsin. But when Putin comes to power, he takes certain steps to develop Russia's economy and military. Gradually coming up the ranks of, or coming up the hierarchy of states in such a way that it was in a position to counter Western narratives and Western strategies since, say, 2008. Okay, and that was also one of the a particular time when Putin had gate crashed into I think it was a summit of Council of Europe or something, and he said that since I was not invited, right? Let me say that this cannot go on, right? This is not done. This is not how you treat Russia. And after that, he invaded Georgia. Okay, so NATO threat perceptions with regard to Russia has changed with the changes in Russia's hard power. Okay, it was something in the 1990s where Russia was extremely weak, right? If you consider it like the Chinese, China says from 1840s to the 1940s is the century of national humiliation. Why is that so? Because China was broken into various parts, right? And China, because of its internal weakness, was continuously taken advantage of by the Americans, by the British, French, Dutch, Japanese, Russians, what have you. Right? So same with the Russians. When it was weak, NATO or the US did not consider it as a threat. When it attacked Georgia, the threat perception changed a bit. When it invaded and occupied Crimea, the threat perception became different. And now, in 2022, nobody thought that Putin would go to war, right? They thought nuclear deterrence and everything would work, but that actually didn't work. So now the threat perception is at its height because of the way in which Russia has developed and Russia has shown its intentions, right, of behaving in international affairs. Right? So it keeps changing. Don't think that threat perceptions remain static. It keeps changing with changing geopolitics. Right? Great.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Malina Rai and I am from the Department of Political Science, first year.
Okay.
So, actually I have two questions, but I'll just ask one.
No, you can ask two. If your friends permit, that is, I mean, like, they must be hungry.
Yeah, lunch time started 1 hour ago.
So,
My God, I'm really sorry.
So maybe they are ready.
so my first question was that in the current geopolitical turmoil, what do you think that what role could India play as an emerging superpower, and the fact that it will be holding the G20 summit this coming September?
Okay. Now you have asked me a tricky question. I can openly deride the Americans and the Russians, but should I openly deride India? Right. That is again geopolitical. But anyway, is that your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So first of all, India is not a superpower or a great power by any stretch of the imagination. I think when I say that, I will probably not be hounded. Right. Well, so, but I say this very respectfully, right? Why do I say this? I say this because if you look at quantitative metrics, right? You can sit down if you wish, right? If you look at quantitative metrics, India is, I believe, the 5th largest economy and the 4th largest military in the world. So, going by hard power, you have India as probably a great power. It will not be a superpower because those days are over. We are living in a multipolar moment, not even a unipolar moment. But India has not achieved this by itself. That is, it has a huge import dependence of munitions, equipment, import dependence on basic goods pertaining to daily, day-to-day life, science and technology. Even the laptops are not created in India, made in India. Right? So once it becomes self-sufficient, would we actually get to call ourselves a great power? Otherwise not, right? Otherwise that great power status is coming at a huge cost to the national exchequer. And that is also one of the reasons why. And if we are, just like I gave you the example of Russian oil and equipment, military equipment, if we are dependent on certain countries, we will not be able to practice our strategic autonomy. It will remain theoretical. It will not be practical. That is, we will not be able to take an independent stand on world affairs because we are indebted to a particular country, or we are dependent on the product of a particular country, right? So in order to practice strategic autonomy, in order to actually, because G20 doesn't matter. G20 presidency would have come to India one way or the other because it is done alphabetically, right? Right, come on, right? There is a lot of talk about G20, but sooner or later India would have led the G20. But the point is, as a good realist, let me again reiterate, multilateralism or plurilateralism does not work if you don't have power. If you have hard power to back it up with these soft power tools or diplomacy, only then it works. Otherwise it is useless. Nobody cares about what India thinks till the time India is actually a powerful nation. So India has said that India will remain neutral, and that is why India has abstained from many UN votes on this particular issue. And I do believe India will stay neutral because India does not have anything else to do right at this point, frankly speaking. Right? So that is about it. Right? I don't think India will make any significant difference now in the world till the time we actually have self-sufficiency. Right? Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Gaur Pradhan from Political Science Department again. So I want to ask regarding the who stands to gain from the war, and it's written People's Republic of China. Sir, how? So will you please elaborate on that point?
Yes, thank you. So, I said that very briefly, right? I said that, can I have that? Yeah. I said that two vested interests would stand to gain from this war, right? First is the US or Western military-industrial complex, right? And military-industrial complex is what President Eisenhower had warned the world against. That is, US, the nexus between the American military and the American industrialists would actually lead to more problems than America is in a position to solve. And he said it back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when he was going out as the President of the United States. John F. Kennedy became the President then. So, military-industrial complex, why? Because if you look at certain trade matrix, right, then you'll see that since the war began in Ukraine, the most amount of profit has been reaped by US oil companies to the tune of almost $250 billion. ExxonMobil itself, just one company, think about it, has minted money to the tune of $60 billion since February 2022, taking advantage of American sanctions on Russia right? Stopping it from selling oil. So these countries are actually benefiting from the war. And it is because of these countries that the Americans are probably not wanting to stop the war through diplomacy and continuously sending more arms and aid to Ukraine. Probably. Right? There's no hard evidence, but that is a possibility because the same thing happened in Iraq's in American invasion of Iraq, right? US oil companies stood to gain. Now, as far as your question is concerned, the People's Republic of China, why does it get to gain, right? Because of narratives. Because China is saying that we are a benign Russia, and Russia is the hostile Russia that the West cannot control, but we can. And that is the reason why China is solidly backing the Russians to win this war. Because they stand to gain from it. You know why? Because of two reasons. First, if Ukraine falls, NATO is discredited. If NATO is discredited, it is to China's gain. Because China is a peer competitor of the US. The next superpower, the superpower in waiting. Right? The hyperpower in waiting. And not only that, if more and more American money and resources and arms and ammunition are bogged down in the war in Ukraine, it means it sort of clears the path for the People's Republic of China to go on and invade Taiwan anytime it feels like. Right? So again, strategy. So these are fundamentally two reasons because, and on top of that, the more and more aid that the Americans send to the Ukrainians, the more and more its international debt increases. The more its international debt increases, the more the Chinese economy becomes stronger than the American economy. Right. All these things taken together, China is actually a net winner in this particular war. Right? Who stands to gain? These two parties do stand to gain, but definitely not either the Russians or the Ukrainians. They are losing. Right? Both are losing. And even if Russia wins, Russia is going to win a very ugly victory in Ukraine. Not a clear-cut victory. Not a very happy ending to this story. Right? Anyway.
Yeah, I get that. That's my cue of going out. Right?
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Ekta Thapa and I'm from Political Science Department, 5th semester. So my question is, how does the Russia invasion of Ukraine impact the global economy, specifically of India? Why should Indians be afraid of the consequences of the war? Thank you.
Can I have?
It is affecting the global economy because it is affecting global supply chains, right? And when I talk of supply chains, I don't mean only, trade of day-to-day products or very normal goods like grain, right? Food crops, cash crops, and so on, right? Because Ukraine is one of the major grain producers in the world, right? It is not just that. It is also because this war has, not just the war, but also the Russian sanctions, right? American sanctions on Russia have destabilized the flow of strategic materials around the world. Like oil, like precious metal, and so on, right? So the economic implications are felt around the world because, because of the war in Ukraine, fertilizer prices have gone up, right? And very paradoxically, you will see that once the war in Ukraine ends, because of the fact that there will be too many oil suppliers, right? There's a possibility that the price of oil will go up. So if the price of oil goes up, then things become more and more, sleek, right? Our purchasing power decreases, right? So there are various ways of analyzing this and trying to form a conclusion with regard to what would be the economic impact of this war. And as far as India is concerned, yes, of course, India is also in a pickle, right? Just think of the fact that ever since the beginning of the war, we have not been in a position to replace, train wheels, right? There's a shortage of train wheels in India because that is majorly produced in Ukraine. So all of us are actually together in this, right? But all of us are not equally responsible for this. There are some states which are responsible for this. States which are now bent on passing the buck. Right? So that is my interpretation. You may differ with me, right? You're free to do that. Okay. So let's see.
There is one more.
I get it. Right.
Hello, sir. So my name is Patrick Lepcha and I'm from 5th semester, Political Science Department. And so my question is, one question, sir.
Yeah.
Was USA sanctioned by ICJ when on conflict on Israel in 2003? Was USA sanctioned by ICJ, International Court of Justice, on conflict on Israel in 2003?
I don't remember.
So that's third. The question here is that Ukraine and USA are fighting for this sanctioning Russia on Ukraine and Russia war. So it is not that is it not that it is a major blunder to the ICJ justice system of the world?
It is a major blunder as far as the entire sanctioning system is concerned.
Yes,
because trust me, sanctions hardly ever work. Right? I have been writing a particular paper with Dr. Zab Mahmood of Presidency University. He's one of my teachers. And in that particular paper, in the quantitative analysis, it is exactly what we show, that sanctions hardly ever work the way that they are intended to, right? And not only that, why just justice, right? Consider economics. Major sanctions that have been put against the Russians have blown back, have sort of exploded on the face of the US, right? It almost gives you the impression of what happened in 1998 when we tested the nuclear bomb. Major sanctions that the Americans had put on us, right? Do you know why those sanctions were taken back, rolled back? It was not because of the Indians, right? Because of Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't matter in the scheme of things. Pakistan is, it's a failed state of sorts, right? It is not because of Pakistan. It is simply because of American business interest, right? If you want to read a book on this, especially with regard to your first question, because I really don't remember, right? If you want to read a book on this, there is a book by Stephen Wald and John Muir Sheimer called The Israel Lobby, right? It is very easily available on Amazon. You can just sort of buy the book and read it yourself. And I exactly don't recall. So it is because of the fact that major American business houses said that these sanctions against the Indians are actually hurting our interests. So please drop them. So whatever you sanction, there is a possibility, a huge possibility, that if you are the sanctioner, you are also sticking your neck out. That is, your economy can suffer just as much.
So is
those who have power, those who are the power holder, they own the justice system.
Naturally. Especially in international politics. This should not be the case. I mean, like, I can be a little normative as far as domestic politics is concerned, because then I would have to say that all the big business in India hold the justice system hostage. I should not, I can't support that. But as far as international relations are concerned, right, all these things, the ICJ, the ICC, are all controlled by the people who are in a position to exert their power and authority, and who are in a position to build narratives of justice and injustice. If the war on Russia, on Ukraine by Russia is an injustice, then the war on Iraq was also an injustice, which is often not said by Western interests. Right?
So thank you so much. We end with our Q&A session. If anyone has more questions, please feel to ask.
Is that a genuine clap?
Right, okay. We can all meet informally later on.
Formally, we can meet after outside Marengo Hall if you want to ask any questions, clarifications. Okay, so before we close, I would request our ma'am, the head of the department, Ms. Chivitaman, to kindly hand over our token of appreciation to Dr. Shauradip Sen.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon to our guest, Dr. Shauradip Sen, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, North Bengal University. On behalf of my department, I'd like to thank Sir Shauradip Sen for taking out his time to deliver his special lecture on the topic "Not a Bang but a Whimper: Interrogating the War on Ukraine" to our students. So it was an enlightening session. I hope our students have learned something from this particular special lecture program. Right? So with this, I would also like to thank my departmental faculties, and special thanks to Mr. Minju Serpa, because he took the initiative of inviting our guest to our department. And thank you to the logistics team, headed by Prudence, and to the tech team, Mr. Sebastian Roby, sir, and Yadika ma'am for arranging the YouTube to stream for the program. So with this, and thank you lastly to all the students for your cooperation. And with this, I'd like to say that now we have come to the end of the program. So you people are relieved now. So it was a good session. Thank you.
I would request ma'am to kindly hand over the token of appreciation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we finally come to the end of our event. We'll take a photo. Rest, I think each department is also here. Okay, I think they have already left. So we'll take a group photo and we'll go for lunch. Okay? Political Science Department, as ma'am has already said, you have a special permission. You can have your lunch, half an hour extra time.
You'll be getting 1 hour, don't worry.
1 hour, ma'am is saying. Okay, we'll take one quick group photo. Please come in, everyone.
Yeah, it's possible. We did it last time.
Everyone.
It is possible. We did it last time.